Hey everybody, welcome to our Learning at Lunch webinar. I'm Mike Murata, the director of the Richard West Assistive Technology Advocacy Center. So glad you're here with us today. We are very excited to welcome Sarah and Jim in, and they will be taking us through this conversation about inquiry strategies and how that can support authentic inclusion for students with complex needs. If you're here joining us live, please make sure that you have your chat box open. Feel free to drop some questions and comments in there. And as we go through, I'm sure Sarah will watch it as we go. Maybe we'll answer them during, but we'll definitely leave some time at the end. So feel free to drop things in there. And we will address them as we go. So again, thanks for being here. I am going to turn my camera off and drift away. And so Sarah and Jim, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, thank you, Mike. Hi, everybody. It's fun to see some familiar people in the chat. So when we logged in, Mike was really taken aback because we're in the same room, which I know we're not seeing a lot of right now, but we're in the same family, so it's okay. So anyways, we are here talking about inquiry strategies and how that sort of method of teaching or pedagogy can be used to really authentically include students with complex needs. And of course, we're going to talk more about what we mean by that. So my name's Sarah Gregory. I'm a speech pathologist and assistive technology consultant in the Ithaca City School District in upstate New York. I have put my social media here. I share a lot of like technology tips, stuff about AAC in particular on Twitter and Instagram. I also have a YouTube channel that kind of talks about how to do some different things, support specifically for teletherapy, like making things in Google Slides, stuff like that. So you can find all of that stuff or connect with me if you have questions after this or other thoughts at Sarah Gregory SLP. And then this is my dad.
I'm a proud dad. Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be among you. I was, for over 30 years, I was an 8th grader. I'm not sure what that qualifies me for, but it certainly taught me a lot. And it set me off on a journey of trying to figure out how I, as a classroom teacher, outnumbered by a lot of adolescents, needed to bring in people to the same table and have everybody find their own place at the table. I was fortunate early on to be given an opportunity to get trained in inquiry. And I set off in shaping my own journey within my classroom with that, one mistake at a time. What I did, I was pleased to find out what it did to provide a learning culture within my room. I also, the ultimate lesson for me, and it took me a number of years to achieve that point, but how self-regulation became a natural progression in by following the strategies of inquiry. I had a number of student teachers from Ithaca College, and when I retired, I was asked to help train science teachers in inquiry, primarily because the videos required to be submitted by these candidates had to show the very same strategies that we used in inquiry. And it was a delight to see that. My involvement here today stemmed from a conversation that began about a year ago with my daughter as I listened to her talk about her challenges, and I realized that the challenges that she was having were the same challenges that I had for so long. And it led to a conversation about how my experiences might help her experiences.
Yeah, so we've obviously both kind of, we have these two different fields. As a general education teacher, and then as a speech pathologist, I'm working kind of in the special ed domain. But we, of course, being in the same family, talk about, I've heard my dad talk for years about inquiry, and especially once you started teaching at Ithaca College, just about these strategies. And every time I heard something, sort of something you would do in your classroom, I thought like, wow, that could really be used to work with the students or to support the students that I'm working with. So we're kind of like marrying those two perspectives to talk a little bit about, as you said, this inquiry strategy. So if anybody wants the slides, there's a bit.ly link or the QR code here. If you just open the camera on your phone and hold it up to that QR code, the slides will open if you want access to that. So I'll leave that up for a second. And I think we already kind of talked about why we're here, just sort of just developed out of conversation and us thinking about sort of saying like, oh, that makes sense to me and that makes sense to me. And that for me, I work in a public school setting. So a lot of our students that have really complex needs are integrated into the general ed classroom. And it's really hard. When I first started doing this, I thought like, I'm willing to support this, of course, but some like buy me the book or sign me up for the webinar or the training, show me how to do this. And there, I found very quickly that there's no roadmap. It's kind of all trial and error. And I also think that if we can use strategies like inquiry methodology that general ed teachers are already doing and is already a really kind of great best practice for your classroom, if we can see how that supports our students with complex needs, that makes it a lot easier for teachers because we're not asking them to just reinvent the wheel for one student. We're really looking at strategies that are going to support everybody.
I start off with this quote just to illustrate how old this methodology is. It's been around for a long time. Socrates, several centuries BCE, and that approach still applies. I don't think I need to read these to you. But please understand, for my purpose today, I need to put the focus on questioning and how that questioning is answered within a collaborative team and what that collaboration provides for the students, especially inclusive students, but selfishly, what it offers a teacher. It makes the day a whole lot easier. What it does for classroom management was a delightful effect that took me years to figure out and get really good at. Everything that a student discovers within the attempt to question is supported by evidence. I don't think I need to suggest to you how appropriate that is given to today's political world. I don't want to get in the way of you reading as I talk, but please understand that one of the most important things I found out is that by following inquiry, mistakes weren't something to be avoided or to feel bad about. In fact, I would congratulate students when they made a mistake because they were on to the next lesson.
And that's one of those things I hear about and I say, that's great for my students. Like we make mistakes all the time. And if we're in a learning environment where there's one right answer or you're being quizzed with words that you don't have access to because you have a communication device, we're not setting you up for success, right? And so I do want to note that we're sort of using the terminology of inquiry. In our district, when we use these inquiry strategies, we might call the lessons project-based learning or case studies. So you might hear or you might be familiar with different terms, but that's kind of all sort of under the same pedagogy. And inquiry is, we could probably talk all day about this, but because we have half hour, we sort of asked ourselves, what would be the most important, like, let's pull one thing out that we want to talk about for this half hour, I got ahead of myself. Essential questions, but we'll talk about this slide. I thought it was, do you want to talk about this? We already talked about mistakes advancing learning. And we've talked about differentiation and how that is something that was just sort of, if you're following an inquiry methodology, you're building in differentiation for everybody. You're not only differentiating if you have a student with an IEP in your room, correct?
The idea of self-regulation is incredible. I learned from the early years of my career that being in charge was exhausting. And it was only when the learners in my room took responsibility for their own behavior and then took care of those within their team that I could sit back and watch the fun. One other thing with regard to my conversations with Sarah throughout this past year is that questions automatically differentiate. If the questions are centered on an experience, everyone perceives from that experience differently, and it's amazing how many different questions that come from each individual. Absolutely delightful.
So here's where I thought we were going. We're talking about essential questions.
And what they do for an inclusive classroom. They will quickly differentiate. The second one, by answering questions within a collaborating team, you necessarily have to bump up the conversation. You have to use the vocabulary words within a content, and you practice the skills within a particular discipline, but also the skills that you get from collaborative problem solving applies to every other teacher's classroom. If I, as an inquiries instructor, do my job, I've made the life of the history teacher better. Also, an essential questioning allows people to go as deep as they can. The academic student will have 27 ideas, and the student who needs more support comes up with 2 or 3. Doesn't matter, it's their best.
And so when we talk about deeper thinking, this was just sort of the term that we kind of came up with because I was thinking of something that, this is all where our claim is that we're leading to a more inclusive classroom. And so when I say authentic inclusion, that term, what I'm meaning is that sometimes we see people say, yeah, we do inclusion. This student is including because they're physically present in the classroom. And so for me, that's not inclusion. If a student is in your classroom, but is sitting at a separate table with their aide doing separate work, that's not really what our goal is. Authentic inclusion is that our student is participating with their peers, doing, maybe it's the same work, maybe it's adapted in some way, but that everybody is achieving at their highest level. And you're not just sitting there sort of going through the motions so that it looks like you have the same textbook open as everybody else. But really, what are we asking all the students to do? It's to answer these essential questions, and we're setting it up in a way so that everyone can answer the questions at their own level.
Essential question. From my own experience, it took me a while to get really adept at essential questions. And in my teaching at Ithaca College, the candidates, who were all very sharp people, and it was always science candidates, they struggled with an essential question for a remarkably long time because it wasn't their common experience. They were, as many science students are, they're good at memorizing, and they love content, and they love the unique vocabulary. The essential question takes you out of that. The essential question has to be based on the real world, and the essential question has to be good today and will be equally good 10 years from now. That's what I mean by timeless. It requires uncovering. You've got to do something. In the science classroom, there was always measuring. There was always extrapolating, and once you start uncovering something, you discover something else, which leads to something else, which is the last bullet there, that it always leads to more questions determined by the learner.
And so we're kind of talking about some science examples. We'll give examples for different subjects, but because we're talking more about science because you taught science, but this is not specific to science, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And so the other thing I was going to mention is in applying to the real world, sort of a strategy and inquiry is that rather than you standing in front of the class and the first part of the class be, I'm going to lecture you about the parts of a flower, you experience something in the real world, whether it be a video or, we are kind of playing around with the example of like labeling parts of a flower or what does a flower need to live. And instead of talking about that first, we might, cut flowers and put one in a vase with water and one in a vase without water, and then we observe what happens. So it's kind of, we recognize that everybody has something different to bring to the classroom. Everybody has different experiences with life. Someone being born, is it farm animals? And so we're all bringing our own experiences to observe what happens to the flower, and then everybody really has something to contribute. So something that, as my dad describes these things to me, and I specialize in working with students who use AAC, augmentative and alternative communication. And so teaching strategy that I always think of is the descriptive teaching model, which is created by Gail Van Tatenhove. So this is something that's widely used and accepted in our field of AAC. So to sort of do a brief overview of it, what the principle is that if we have an AAC device and we have picture symbols representing our language, we have limited real estate. It's not a dictionary. We cannot put a picture of every single academic word in that device, or it would become a mess. But about 80% of what we say as adults is a subset of only 300 to 400 core words. So when we're teaching language on an AAC device, we really focus on these core vocabulary words. But I think our students, especially as they get into secondary grades and there's more of a focus on academics and academic language, sometimes I see teams that want to program in barometer, osmosis, and all these academic words that are really specific to just one lesson. But we need to be kind of more flexible in how we think about that, and how can we describe academic concepts with these frequently used words, because we're going to give our students more communicative power if we do that. And many content words aren't used outside of the lesson, which I didn't put an example, but like, for example, barometer. If we're learning about that and talking about that, and that's the word that's on your quiz, that's how you're testing your student to know if they understand your lesson, they're going to leave our science class and not need to use that word at home or not use it in their English class. So we're not really giving them communicative power. And so let's do this quote first, and then I'll get to that point. But anyways, Kata Hearn wrote a really nice blog post about the descriptive teaching model, which is linked in the last slide. And one thing that she says is that we need to start asking questions that allow our students to answer using the words that are already on their device. So to me, I'm really thinking about these essential questions, or when we teach lessons through that inquiry pedagogy, that these are questions that our students can answer with the words on their device. We're not necessarily programming in a ton of academic vocabulary. So what does that look like? Gail Van Tatenhove made this chart. I kind of took her idea and adapted it, where she has referential teaching style and her descriptive teaching method. How we adapted it was here on the left, the referential teaching style is something that we see traditionally in academic lessons. And then we're looking at kind of converting that to essential questions and what core vocabulary words we might now be able to use. So for example, a science example is, a traditional question might be, what are 3 categories of rock? So to get that correct, or to succeed in that class, we would have to program into a student's device, sedimentary, metamorphic. And if that's all they're doing to prove their knowledge, or that's all we're asking them to do, they can push those buttons and they can leave, but what did they really come away with, right? Is that deeper level thinking? So instead, we could ask an essential question, such as, how does the surface of the earth change over time? And if we're asking students to start answering that question, what words that are already on their device could we use? Change, water, hot, time, plants, weather. So descriptive teaching is really taking a word, a sort of academic or tier 3 vocabulary word, and then using more common words to describe it. So like one common one is, instead of saying banana, you could say curved yellow fruit, and everybody would know what you're talking about. So how can we describe these more academic concepts with core vocabulary? An example from math is the referential teaching style might ask, what is the equation for speed? But in our inquiry lesson, we might change that to, how can a graph show the motion of an object? And again, we would do an experiment first, right? We wouldn't teach the equation for speed or, try to answer this question right off the bat. We would start graphing, I don't know what this would necessarily look like, motion of objects.
We could roll a ball down a ramp and time that, and then graph that and graph different objects.
And so if a student doesn't necessarily have the language to describe the equation for speed, I don't even know what that would be, they could experience the ball rolling down the ramp and say, was it fast? Was it slow? This one was different because it was faster. It's moving, stop and go. They can use numbers to start helping their team graph that information. Next example we have is from social studies. So a question might be, name 3 generals from the Civil War. So again, we would have to program specific people into the device, which are not going to be talked about after this specific lesson is over. They might not even be mentioned again within that class for the whole year. So are we really giving our students communicative power if we use this referential teaching style? And if a student is included in a general education classroom that's using this style, not that it should never be used, of course, there's a time and a place we need to talk about academic vocabulary, but if this is the only way we're measuring students' success, we're sort of setting them up for failure. So if instead we talked about why do we continue to have wars? And so through answering that question, we might talk about the Civil War and we might talk about specific people, but we're also going to be able to use core vocabulary, such as different sides, fight, hate, food, reasons for war. Now, the last one we came up with was for English or ELA, and we might ask, name 3 literary devices. So the answer, can you think of programming this into a student's device? Simile, metaphor, imagery, and just being able to answer that question, is that deeper level thinking, or is that just sort of memorization? It depends. So instead, we could ask the question, how does an author capture a reader's attention? And again, you can see, as my dad mentioned in one of the previous slides, that these questions are timeless. So we always are going to want to know, when I choose a book, I have my criteria of how an author captures my attention. So how do they do that? I like books that are funny, not scary, things that I like. What was the word? You said affinity. And I said, okay, well, affinity, that's kind of, again, a higher level vocabulary word, but what does that mean? Something that's like me, something I relate to. So again, that's using the descriptive teaching model to talk about these concepts. We want our students to receptively understand these things. And again, through answering the question, the essential question of how does an author capture a reader's attention, we might talk about simile and metaphor and imagery, but that's not going to sort of be where it ends or the only way that we're measuring students' understanding. Anything to add?
No,
okay.
I don't.
Okay. So now we're going to talk about some different ways of, we have about 5 minutes. We might go a little bit over. Well, we can kind of wrap this up, but we're going to talk about some different ways, just sort of some examples of what this might look like. And also, we recognize that a lot of us are teaching and learning in digital environments right now. So we wanted to provide some ideas that inquiry really involves teaming, and that can be difficult, and I think we're kind of starting to use our breakout rooms and things like that. So in terms of a digital tool to use these strategies in a digital environment, you said that one of the main sort of tools that you used in your classroom was just a whiteboard. So as kids are in teams, they're taking notes, jotting things down, stuff like that. So our friend Alyssa Warren has introduced us and has shared lots and lots about the tool Jamboard, which is a free, just very simple interactive whiteboard. So it kind of just shows how we can translate these things from in-person to a digital environment. So something we talked about was these are different types of rocks, right? So we could ask students label each type of rock. So again, that's asking them to say, label igneous, whatever the other ones were. Or if we were in person, what my dad's example is give them a bucket of tons of different types of rocks and say, sort them. So then students are having to look at the patterns of the rocks, notice different things, ask questions of how is this one like this one? And something we could do is, here's an example of Jamboard. It would be a little bit more difficult because we're not able to feel and stuff like that. But if we're in distance learning, we kind of have to work with what we've got. So we could say sort these rocks, and within Jamboard, they could be pulling ones that are the same color, things like that. And then after they sort them, here's a strategy called predictable chart writing, which is commonly used with our students who have more complex needs. And something I really like about predictable chart writing is that it can be really differentiated. So we're asking every student in the whole class to fill out this predictable chart. So take one of the groups of rocks that you sorted and let's describe them. These rocks are black. These rocks are speckled. These rocks are smooth. So you could say a very long answer. You could say sedimentary. So we're not saying never use these academic or tier 3 vocabulary words, but we're just saying you don't have to use those to be successful. And then at the end, I got this tip from Erin Sheldon, who's an educational consultant and works with AAC, that she said when she does predictable charts, she likes to at the end do a not. So these rocks are not one color. So we're noticing how they're alike and we're noticing how they're different. And again, every student in your team and every student in your class is being asked to respond in the same way. And it's just sort of automatically differentiated because everybody can respond at their level. So now here's this short video that this is just another kind of idea of how we could make these things digital, and just sort of the idea that instead of you standing in front of the class and lecturing about how the earth changes, we might first just watch a video and experience something. This is really short. So then after the students watch and experience that, we might ask a question, what might be causing this? And if you're in person, they could jot it down on whiteboards. If you're in person, you might have students pull out their iPads or their Chromebooks and use Jamboard. And so students are putting up Post-its of making guesses of what might be causing this. So you can see somebody said, this is just an example, but let's say somebody said erosion. So that's a more academic term, right? But that's great. That fits along with what our question is. Or somebody might say water. So that's a core word that's going to be on all of our students' devices. So again, they don't have to have the word erosion. They could use descriptive teaching to describe erosion that goes down, things like that. And so next, again, my dad said that something he did a lot on whiteboards was in inquiry, we make a claim and then we show evidence to support that claim. And so how simple, this doesn't have to be a fancy tech tool in order to put this in a digital environment. We can just treat this like a whiteboard and say on this side, type in your claim or put a Post-it note or draw something, and then we'll show evidence to support the claim. And so the way that you do this had done this in your class was through heterogeneous groupings or teams of students that had different levels of support needs. So that's kind of where we're going to wrap up, because that teaming is sort of the next thing that we would think about discussing in this process. And of course, this webinar is about to be over, but if there's, people are interested in part 2, we can sort of start setting this scene for why teaming is important.
I would be happy to talk more about teaming, because that was the most transformative part of my experience with inquiry. Not only what it did for the learners, but what it did for the classroom environment. It just allowed us to laugh and have a whole lot of fun. Also using techniques like a whiteboard with regard to classroom management. All I had to do was walk from group to group and look at the whiteboard, and I knew exactly how well they were doing and what questions I needed to ask them to either to refocus, or what I usually ended up doing was simply compliment. And that changes the flavor of a classroom more than anything else.
So I was writing down quotes that my dad said as we were discussing this and put them into some slides. And so this was one of them of why would we divide students up into teams? And one reason is because none of us are as smart as all of us. And I liked that because thinking about sort of our group of, my friends and familiar people I see in the chat here, that we talk about this a lot. If I'm the speech pathologist that's consulting with your classroom, and we bring in the special ed teacher and we talk about how are we including these students, it's not just up to me as the assistive technology consultant to say, do inquiry, and this is how I recommend it. But when we all work together and we sort of use more of a coaching or collaborative approach, whether we're adults or whether we're 8th graders or preschoolers, we're going to come up with better ideas when we use that sort of group approach, right?
One challenge I found when in my early days, when my classroom was somewhat traditional, how easy it was for learners, particular learners, to hide. In a team, no one can hide and everyone has something to offer. I would also say that the nice stuff doesn't show up right away. It'll take a while, because there'll be friction within teams that are readily addressed and easily addressed simply by asking more questions.
So here are our resources. If you want to learn more about the descriptive teaching model, you can definitely Google Gail Van Tatenhove. Here's a blog post that I linked from Kate Ahern that's very short and I think just summarizes it really nicely. In terms of learning more about inquiry, this was a book that my dad had recommended that this is what you've kind of used, right?
It's a great book. It was delightful, filled with all sorts of informative quotes, and just a lot of food for thought. Grant Wiggins is dead now, but he was back in the early days. He was one of the leaders of the authentic assessment movement.
And I put the link there to Amazon if you're interested in that. Jamboard, I did not go over, how do you grab the Post-its and stuff like that. I have a really short YouTube video that I linked. If you are not familiar with Jamboard and you want just like a quick look at how to use it, if you want more in-depth information from the expert or the Jamboard queen, there's this longer webinar about using Jamboard to create interactive learning activities by Alyssa Warren. So definitely check that out. And then that's it. We did pretty good on time. And thank you so much for listening. We put both of our emails. Are you okay if people email you with questions?
Of course.
As am I. So if you have any thoughts that you want to share or something you want to learn more about, really anything, I think we're both happy. I'm always thrilled to talk about this stuff. So if anybody has any questions, that's our 30 minutes. So definitely feel free to sign off if you have to go to your next thing, or if anybody wants to stick around and ask questions. I saw some positive feedback in the chat. Thank you so much.
Positive feedback?
I know.
Oh, who knew?
I know you didn't bring down my vibe that much.
Guys, that was awesome. That was so much fun. I really enjoyed that. And Jim, you gave me a book recommendation. I know people always accuse me of spending their money by giving book recommendations, and I appreciate you giving one. I'm going to look at that one when we're done. Grant Wiggins has some great stuff, and I don't think I've ever read that book.
It's dry, of course. It was a textbook, but simply because of my affinity for inquiry, I enjoyed it. It was very well written. It was easy to read.
Yeah, that's great. It made me smile because we talk in our town hall meetings that we do on Mondays. 2 weeks ago, we talked about good questioning and how to facilitate coaching, like Sarah was talking about. And it made me laugh as you were talking, Jim, because I reached over to the stack of books that sits on the side of my desk, and I have a more beautiful question, the power of inquiry to spark breakthrough ideas. So just to get a plug in for someone else to buy a book. Yes, there you go. Yeah. Yeah.
And it was interesting because as we made this presentation, the title slide, that was our essential question, was how can we use this methodology to support all students? And then as we talked about and created the presentation, we kept asking more essential questions. And you can see I could not use any of my 8th grade science knowledge for sure. I had to use my dad to get some of these examples, but because, I'm able to ask questions. And of course, that's something as adults we're learning and I'm using in my job all the time. So if we teach that to 8th graders or to preschoolers, that's really a life skill that can transfer across any subject.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that whole idea of teaching that skill that is evergreen, kind of like the questions we're searching for, those evergreen skills. And also when you were both talking about this idea that the teams give everyone an opportunity to highlight their expertise in something. We all have an expertise in something. We all have knowledge that will make the team better. And I think it's nice. And I enjoyed Jim, hearing from you and how you built that environment within your classroom to honor every learner and their value to the overall goal of the learning in the classroom. So thank you for that. That was nice to hear.
No, thank you. To a large degree, I was motivated by selfishness. I found out that in doing this, I had a much easier job.
Yeah.
Are many people listening to this?
Yeah. It's just us, Jim. Pretend it's just us. No, there's still people listening.
20 people are here.
Okay.
So don't talk about them is what I'm about to say. Don't say anything about people.
I didn't want to over lament on how new the question, how new to many people's agenda questioning is. And I always want to assure people that one of the nicest things I found out from inquiry is the world of mistakes. And what I often preface any presentation I had on inquiry was that I did have an advantage over the people who are listening to what I was about to say. And that thing was I had made many, many, many more mistakes than they had, simply because I've had more time on the planet.
Right.
And that was my only advantage.
Yeah, exactly. And again, that in itself builds a sense of community to that learning experience of that it's okay. We're going to make a mistake. I've made dozens of them already today and it's only noon. That's fine. And they'll continue on as the day goes on. That's okay. But it's nice to be able to build that environment where that is okay and it's welcomed.
And it avoids the really sad thing about our profession is that mistakes make people feel bad. They're embarrassed.
Yeah.
And they shut down because of that. Whereas with inquiry, confusion is a powerful thing, but only if confusion is addressed immediately, which is what the collaborative team does.
Yeah, it's very true.
Part two.
I said it in the chat. I'll say it to you guys when I have my camera on. Yes, I'm ready for part 2. You guys tell me when your schedules work and we will set that up. That would be awesome. We would love that.
That would be fun. For
anybody else who's still on, if you have other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We've gotten incredibly low key right now. Open up your microphone and ask it too. That's fine too. I'm game for that, whatever. I want to thank you guys for your time today. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having us, Mike. Thanks for giving us a platform.
Yes, of course. Welcome it. It's great. And start thinking about part 2. I'm really serious about that. I'm ready.
All right. We'll do it.
All right. Awesome. Okay. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope to see you guys soon in another webinar. Maybe even part 2 of this.
Thanks,
all the best.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it. Oh, here's one question just shot in real fast. Sarah, before you leave. Amanda, did you get any pushback from other teachers for not having the students be required to use the scientific terms?
Yes. Yep. I've gotten a lot of pushback about that when I start talking about the descriptive teaching model, because it's really hard for them to think about, well, how is the student going to participate if I don't program in the word barometer? So here's a good example that I used that last year with one of my 3rd graders. Up until 3rd grade, they were really heavily programming in academic vocabulary, and his system was becoming a mess to the point where it was hard for him to just communicate about daily things because everything was like an over button in different folders. And so as we were describing this to the team, and it specifically, we were talking about the word barometer was the word in the lesson, and they really wanted to program that in. But the SLP said, we talked about a barometer and I think he got it. And he was saying heavy and light and things like that. And that we were really having a much deeper conversation about what a barometer is than if I had just said, look at this picture, what is it? And he answered barometer. And then another member of the team said, okay, so I am fluent in German and I lived in Germany for a few years and I consider myself to be proficient in the language, but I couldn't tell you how to say barometer in German. So that kind of was like a light bulb that went off for him. And he said, I can get around, I can like teach a college course in, you know, in Germany or whatever he had been doing. But I didn't actually need that word. So I think we kind of get stuck in our one like little lesson or unit. And we're just like, how can we possibly do this without these academic terms? And also some members of the team felt that we were having sort of like a lower expectation because we weren't having this student participate in the same way. But as you can see, as we just kind of discussed this as a team, the school team started to think about, maybe we'll do some of this more like descriptive stuff with all of the students because yeah, if all they're doing is labeling like weather equipment, what are they really walking away with? So I think that that kind of helped. And just to talk about like, what is his device going to look like in high school when we program in like Civil War generals? And so, you know, I am very clear that we want our students to have a receptive understanding of all of these terms. We're not like giving them a free pass to not ever know or use tier 3 vocabulary. The other thing is comprehensive literacy instruction. So we need to be like that predictable chart writing. We need to be weaving in literacy instruction into everything that we do so that when this student can read and write, he can type out the word barometer. So that we're really not limiting our students, but we're also not going to put this overemphasis on just that 20% of nouns that we all use throughout our day.
Right. Amanda had a follow-up, Sarah.
Yeah, sure.
Regarding getting pushback, anytime someone pushes back, you've rattled their cage, and that's a good thing. That in and of itself is not a bad thing. And over the years, I got a lot of pushback. I pissed a whole lot of people off with my embracing of children more than I embrace students. I always said, please just suspend your disbelief for just a bit and give me a chance to show you where not using scientific terms will eventually lay the foundation so that you can use scientific terms. And when they do start using the scientific terms, they have learned far beyond what they would have learned if you had started off with why it's metamorphic.
And so Amanda asked a follow-up question so fringe words were the descriptive words instead of the full scientific terms. So I'm thinking, instead of saying the scientific term like metamorphosis, we're gonna find core words, so those most commonly used words to describe metamorphosis, like change or grow or different. So for a student who's using low tech that maybe doesn't have as many words, I would just, you know, maybe even that word out. So the butterfly is coming out, especially if you're low tech and you don't have many symbols. We don't want to put metamorphosis on there because they're going to go home and that word is not giving them power. But it's also just sort of another reason why we really need to think about having robust systems for our kids we need access to a lot of words so that we can describe these terms that come up in class. If that answers that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, awesome. Cool. Perfect. Thanks, Amanda. All right, guys.
Yeah,
excellent.
thanks for the question.
That was a great question. Yeah, I love it. All right, good. All right. Well, thank you again. Now we'll officially wrap up one more time, and that's okay. I blocked out a whole hour for this, so I'm fine.
Okay.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. Sarah, Jim, again, thank you so much for everything. I appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
All right.
Thank
Take
you.
care. See ya.